I am not exactly prompt, but prompt-ish. Just took my middle son out to dinner. Does it look hazy? I feel like everything looks hazy. Hold on, I'm gonna wipe it off. Let me use a pillowcase from my office. Did that help? Oh, might have been better. This is what happens when you're work from home. You work from your bed. It is Monday night, and I'm Adrienne Wood, Tales of an Educated Debutante. And this Camp Mystic tragedy has been heavy on my heart now for, well, since July 4th, I guess, when most of us heard about it. I don't think there's a person in the world that hasn't inserted themselves in that tragedies, particularly somebody that has grown up going to camp or sending their children to camp. I have 2 at camp right now. My littlest with autism is at his 2nd camp of the summer. That's my dog, Joe. And so my littles with autism is at Camp Royale this week. He was at Camp Trinity last week. My daughter is at a camp now. We're a camp family. I didn't love camp, but I value camp. I just preferred to be home with my mother. So I think there's nothing that feels kind of more safe than like dropping your children off at camp. I think we even acknowledge, like with school shootings, like, okay, well, where public school felt like the safest thing, it doesn't necessarily now. But camp does. Camp Mystic has really a very interesting history. And floods have been a part of, like, let me close this door. My son has friends over. Camp Mystic, floods have been a part of life at Camp Mystic, I think as long as it's been around. It was in 1932 that water rose, water went into the dining hall, and that cabins were washed away in 1932 at Camp Mystic. And so there's a history of flooding there. And I think what I would say after kind of thinking about this the last 10 days is that the question I have that remains is, where were the adults? And, you know, we're hearing from lots of different angles. I think somebody said to President Trump, like, could this have been stopped? And he was like, only an evil person would ask that question. And he's not the only one. I mean, the sheriff's department, the fire rescue people, anybody in that area, the governor, it's like, we're not going to talk about that. Don't ask about that. You know, we're not going to have these conversations. And it doesn't, to have a real conversation isn't, it doesn't have to be a negative thing, right? Like, we can really talk about something in a realistic way, just like we do, let's say, drinking and driving, right? So there didn't used to be a law about drinking and driving. You could drive and drink and drive. And then it might be called like, oh, it was an accident, or oh, it was this. But was it an accident? Because now we say, well, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And so I think it's important to go back to the history and say, okay, was this an accident? Because the word accident, I'll tell you what I think is an accident. I don't think somebody drunk hitting someone is an accident. right? Because they knew if I drink, I'm putting people in danger. An accident to me is I'm minding my own business and I get struck by lightning and the sky is blue. That's an accident, right? Yes, if we have facts. And so, Sue, what's been coming out the last few days, where we're getting stories from the counselors. And I think it's really important to talk about that. And so this question is, was this a terrible accident, or was this preventable? You know, was this an accident or was this preventable? And I guess when I go back to the beginning and I see in 1932, cabins were washed away at Camp Mystic, that doesn't feel like a tsunami to me. That feels like there was something here, right? Um, in 1990, Mr. Eastland, the head of the camp, he and his wife, he said about, they were talking about this new kind of system, and he said, I'm sure there will be other drownings. People don't heed the warnings. And so he said that when they were talking about kind of this warning of talking about flooding. People don't hear the warnings. And so I think one of the biggest things we've heard today is that at 1:15 a.m., Dick Eastland got the alert. It's always watch for a warning, a flood warning at 1:15 a.m. Are you hearing from? Well, Deb, I'm not hearing from any of the surviving counselors. I haven't talked to any of the counselors, but I think when you look at, as I did today for a few hours, when you look at their stories collectively, you see one story because you have a half dozen different counselors from different cabins telling a story, and they match together like a puzzle. You know, it's a puzzle. But if this is hard for you to listen to, then I get it. It's hard, but um, I think it's okay to talk about things. You know, I think it's okay to talk about hard things. And I think if it were my child or my twin daughters, I would have questions. Um, so we know that Dick got the warning at 1:15 in the morning. And I'm also, let me just say this, I'm on the board at Camp Trinity. And we had a meeting last week and we talked about um, where we were with safety. And the president of our board said, this might sound dumb, but is there any way we could flood? And they were like, no, our biggest danger is a hurricane. So a hurricane is not going to happen without warning, right? Like we are at the point now where we have a system in place that a hurricane is not going to sneak up on you. And one thing about our camp, Camp Trinity, is we're accredited. And Camp Mystic was not nationally accredited. And I asked our director, I said, what does this accreditation mean? And she said, the accreditation, she handed us this notebook, and it is full of safety plans. And there's a reason we value universities that are accredited. There's a reason we value camps that are accredited. Accreditation is a big deal. So I think as a parent, when you're sending your child to a school or a camp, you want to ask questions like, are you accredited? If you're not, why not? Same thing with childcare centers. We want childcare centers, that's kind of my area of expertise, that are nationally accredited. It means high quality, right? So I would say accreditation it's not just something that you put out there. Our director was saying last week, boy, accreditation is a big deal. So the warning system. One of the other big things we learned about last week was that The sheriff's department had the ability to send out an alarm, like an Amber Alert, to everyone's phone, and they did not do it until about 3 days later. So they had the possibility, but they did not use it. You know? Can you get insured if you're not accredited? Yes, you can get insured if you're not accredited. Accredited is just means that you've like hit a level of quality that means you're following. And what our director was saying is, wow, the accreditation has a lot to do with these kind of safety plans, and it's a big deal. Yes, so somebody said, well, maybe he didn't get the warning. At 1:14 a.m., the Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for Central Carr County. It says life-threatening flooding is possible. A warning also means dangerous weather is happening or is extremely likely to happen soon. Shortly after the warning went out, National Weather Service Prediction Center said parts of the hill country could get 6 inches of rain over the next 6 hours, and flash flood impacts could be significant. At 3:06 a.m., the National Weather Service says a very dangerous flash flooding event is ongoing in Central Carr County. Okay. Cell coverage. So yes, you're right. There are people, the counselors did not have their phones, which is a little bit unusual. My son was a counselor at Camp Seagull, which is a accredited, well-known camp in North Carolina, and they were not to have their phones while they were with children, but they were allowed to have their phones when they were not with children or in charge of children. And then at Camp Trinity, the counselors also have access to their phones. So that is a little bit different. Do you think your children who are counselors? So, Benita, what I would say to you is very clearly, no one is going to put any blame on children, or not on my watch. There was another camp that also flooded. The director of that camp was awake, watching the news and listening. They evacuated their children, their campers. According to Richard Eastland, who is Dick Eastland's son, he interviewed with the Washington Post. He said the warning came fast. The warning came fast. It did not include an evacuation order, but other camps evacuated without an evacuation order because usually the local authority is who issues an evacuation order. There were 24 counselors interviewed, emergency officials, parent and experts that shared. Dick Eastland talked to his family members and other employees what they were going to do with this alert. And for 1 hour, they didn't do anything as the water rose. For 1 hour, they didn't do anything. And so Camp Mystic sits kind of at the confluence of the South Fork Guadalupe River and Cypress Creek. There were 550 campers asleep in their cabins, and there were 2 adults in charge. So in my mind, why didn't an adult stay awake? This emergency, evidently there was an emergency plan. Where's this plan? It was turned in. Well, what did the plan say? Cabins at this camp washed away in 1932, clearly flooding, just like hurricanes are part of Camp Trinity's plan or Camp Seagull's plan. Flooding should have been in the plan, you know? At 2 a.m., this is kind of what is known. A counselor from the cabin closest to the river, she was from the bug house cabin. She said she ran to the office and said, we have water. Now, Lisa Miller is a parent whose daughter was at camp, and she had 3 daughters at the camp that month. Dick Eastland went down to Bug House to evacuate the girls, put the girls into his truck, Ford pickup truck, and drove them to the rec center, recreation hall. He was able to transfer girls from several cabins close to the river. The last cabin that he went to had the youngest children in it. Bubble, the last cabin, had the youngest children. And like it happened in the 80s, his car was overtaken by water. Night guard Glenn helped save one cabin. Yes, he did. He actually stayed with them throughout the night. Do you hear these people in my house? People love the Eastlands. They loved Camp Mystic. This is like a place where everybody loves. There are these wonderful memories of people's childhoods. I mean, Laura Bush said, I was a counselor at Mystic. Women that are networked from families in Texas, and they are alumni of Camp Mystic. People love Camp Mystic. A lawyer from San Antonio, her 2 children were rescued from Camp Mystic. And I thought this was interesting. She said, leaders, quote, should have been taking every precaution given the risk. My opinion is that they should have been paying attention to those warnings and evacuated the camp. The flooding is not a new thing. I don't know if it's ever been to epic proportions like that, but ignoring the warnings does not make a lot of sense to me. Yes, that's right. It was not a bus from Camp Mystic, but it was from the same river. So he gets the thing at 1:14, according to his family, that he got the severe flood warning alert on his phone. According to his family, he did not begin to evacuate the young campers asleep in cabins near the rapidly rising Guadalupe River for more than an hour after he received the warning. He rallied family members, some of whom lived and worked at the camp, on walkie-talkies to, quote, assess the situation. Soon after the alert went out, said Jeff Carr, the family spokesman. At 2:30 a.m., when the rain was falling hard, Dick Eastland decided to begin evacuating campers. An hour and 16 minutes later, he started evacuating. Are we trying to find out who's to blame? You know, it's not blame in a way that's like, well, it was your fault that happened. It's just that it doesn't make sense, you know? And I think when you think camp accreditation doesn't matter, safety plans don't matter, having children or teenagers in charge doesn't matter, you have got to have an adult be in charge, you know? You know, so I have 4 children. When my children have friends spend the night, or today I was on the beach I had no children with me, so I was doing hanging out with friends. And I was talking to a mom, and she was like, "Excuse me, but I am watching. My son has a friend here, and he keeps going out, and I need to watch him." And so she was taking more responsibility because it wasn't her child. So there are 550 children asleep. And there is a warning at 1:14 a.m. from the National Weather Service that says there is a severe flood. It's a severe flood. Err on the side of caution, right? Like, what is it going to hurt? Everybody gets up and remembers that. The alert at 1:14 a.m. again said, quote, life-threatening flash flooding in Carr County. And there are people here that are now burying their children, and they're hearing that this director got the warning. He didn't like have a heart attack and was asleep. He got the warning and did nothing for an hour and 14 minutes. Where was the safety plan? As the water encroached, this was in the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post have really done an unbelievable job of interviewing and collecting information. It's just amazing. So this is from the Washington Post. It's a quote. As the water encroached, the teenage counselors, cut off from others, were left to make frantic life and death decisions. They began rousing girls from their cabins, the younger campers screaming or crying as they waited for help. Dick Eastland, 70, and other staffers realized that the Bubble Inn and Twins cabins were in the most danger, Eastland Jr. said. Now, meanwhile, they've already evacuated the other cabins. A swirling eddy of water formed from two directions. Dick Eastland and others had the walkie-talkies, which they had used to alert the group at 1:35 a.m. So he had used the walkie-talkies at 1:35 to say, "We have a problem," right? The Hunt Volunteer Fire Department's chief said they never received a request for help from the camp. One of Dick's children, Edward, he went to rescue girls in the twins' cabin, and Dick moved towards Bubble Inn. And again, this is not blame. I think it makes people uncomfortable to own something, but if I go out and I drink a lot of alcohol and I get in a car and I run over some children walking on the road, it's not an accident, because I should have known better. If I didn't know better, I should have known better. There's this minister named Candace McGibbon, and she kind of has this beautiful, wonderful thing that she says. And she says, perhaps this unspeakable tragedy can remind us all that we're human beings with fears and sorrows. Maybe we can put aside differences that estrange us and cause us to blame and focus instead on those things that unite us in our common humanity. The Dalai Lama warns that when you think everything is someone else's fault, you suffer a lot. Religion is simple. It is kindness. Be kind. It's possible. It's available to all of us. But it's okay to call an apple, right? It's okay. It's not, you're not blaming. You're not being a Christian, you know? How much did the camp cost? owning something, but too early to talk negligence. So, Deb, the camp was not accredited. That's a problem, yeah. You get a warning that there's a flash flood coming, and you don't go get the youngest campers beside the river. Two different counselors said that they asked, should we leave the cabin? And a staff member said to them, stay in your cabin. So you have these teenagers who now are making all these decisions. And they're teenagers. I have teenagers. They're not, that it's just not fair to put that on them. So, yes, you have a wailing siren would have helped. So, you have two different things going on. You also have these families that were staying at like RV parks, right? And then you have the question of, do the owners of the RV parks, do they need to warn the people that are staying there? Adrian's not from Texas. She's just, staying. She doesn't have any idea what's happening. And then you have this another thought that if you're an adult, you can use your brain. We all have seen the videos where there's a hurricane and people go swimming in the ocean and they drown. And you're like, well, it was a hurricane. Did somebody need to do a siren to tell you not to get in the ocean? They did. They ran knocking on doors. Yes, I think some people were warned, but some were not. So there's this idea of like, how much are we responsible for doing ourselves? The other night, I was in Raleigh with my daughter Blair, and there was a tornado watch, and there was no warning. And I kept getting up, and granted, this had just happened, so I was a little more on alert, but I was like, I'm going to have to wake her up and take her in the basement. And I remember when our kids were little, and we would get a tornado warning, and we had two in cribs. We would wake them up, take them down to the basement. It was disgusting. It was not great. It was not great. "1:14 a.m., flash flood warning. Life-threatening flooding is possible." At Bubble Inn, which is where no one survived from Bubble Inn, it's still not clear whether the girls were overcome by floodwater inside their cabin or if they were outside trying to escape. That's where Dick was trying to rescue the girls from Bubble Inn. There's still campers missing from Bubble Inn. It was, there was Bubble Inn, Giggle Box, Twins 1 and 2, which sat next to 2, Wiggle Inn. And those kind of junior cabins for the younger children were called the flats because the cottages were on this low-lying, flat piece of land right near the Guadalupe River. The older campers stayed up on Senior Hill. So the girls from Bubble Inn, literally and figuratively looked up at the older girls, which is interesting. Margaret Bellows was a little girl that died, and her mother, Dr. Bellows, said, I love this. She said, the main thing I have to say is unending gratitude for the brave camp counselors who safely evacuated so many campers, and to the 2 camp counselors who gave their lives trying to protect my baby. The accreditation process is especially important when most of the camp leadership is from one family. Oh, that's really a good point. That's really a good point. You're right, because their one son was the head chef, another son, the daughter. They have another daughter that's running another camp. That's really a good point. It's really a good point. Carr County officials, and I said this a little while ago, I just don't get this. They had the technology to turn every cell phone in the river valley into an alarm, but they did not use it. And it wouldn't have made a difference in this case because the counselors didn't have their phones, maybe they didn't have cell service, but they didn't use this system until 2 days after the flood. I don't get that. I do not get that. Um, so they get the alert at 1:15. 1:35 they get another alert. The evacuation didn't start until 2:30 a.m., okay? But at 2 a.m., counselors were awake. People were not asleep. This was not like, oh, we were asleep and woke up underwater. Counselors were given conflicting messages how to keep the campers safe. Ainsley Bashara, 19, a counselor for the Gigglebox cabin, she had 8 to 10-year-olds, told the Washington Post she had sat anxiously watching her campers through flashes of lightning. She checked her watch at 1:58 p.m. Not long after, she heard 8-year-olds in a nearby cabin screaming, and she saw older girls running up the road with blankets and pillows to the recreation hall. "Are we staying or leaving?" she yelled out the window. "Stay in your cabin," she recalled a staff member shouting back. Several counselors said they were told, "Stay in your cabin." Stay in your cabin. And again, what's the emergency plan say? You know, she and other counselors decided to leave at 3 a.m. So that's at 2 a.m. They didn't leave till 3 a.m. A staff member removed the window screens, allowing them to escape. The counselors took the girls through waist-high water and up a nearby hill. She said she could hear girls in another cabin begging for help over the roaring river. Laura Clement said her daughter Nancy, an 18-year-old counselor, was woken up by the rain at 1:30 a.m. As the water rushed inside the staff cabin, the Baylor University student climbed to the roof. She was still there at 5 a.m. when she texted her mother that she was safe. Eastland Jr. said the family eventually located his brother Edward clinging to a tree with 10 to 12 girls about 200 yards from their cabin. They had all survived. His father was found in a black SUV with 3 other girls from the camp that he'd been trying to rescue. No one made it. Dick Eastland died on the way to the hospital. In interviews, parents faulted not only the camp, but also Carr County and other authorities for not responding quickly to the Weather Service and other warnings. Carr County Judge Robert Kelly said at a news conference, no one knew this kind of flood was coming. But the National Weather Service issued a report that it was coming. He said, "This is the most dangerous river valley in the U.S., and we deal with floods on a regular basis. When it rains, we get water. We had no reason to believe that this was going to be anything like what's happened here. None whatsoever." And the floods recede. Nobody from camp, they didn't call anybody for help. They didn't call for help. The camp, if they have the safety plan, they didn't alert parents of what had happened until I think it was maybe 11 in the morning, 11:30. Um, the parents are watching things online, watching this, and these camp officials are literally trying to manage this rescue situation. They didn't call the fire department or the sheriff's department say, we're missing campers. I just don't. Everything was reactive, you know? If you said to me, boy, he got that alert and they started evacuating kids and they didn't get the alert in time. You know, there's so many ways you could say, and did anybody want those children to drown? No. But if you said, could you do something better? You know, as parents, we look back and say, when would we do something better? Um, and like Deb Davis, I realize you don't agree with this conversation. It's making you uncomfortable. You don't want anybody to take responsibility. That's fine. But I bet if you were bearing your twin daughters, you would have some questions. And I think it's right to say, boy, we love a family camp and this is wonderful, but like, is it safe? Was this safe? Was it safe? I think what I would say to parents is I think the accreditation is a big deal. Um, you really, when you're choosing a camp for your child, ask, are you accredited? I mean, this is important. Um, this is important. And I think we have to say to ourselves, boy, do we ask questions like that when our children go somewhere? When we get a flood, a tornado uh, warning on our phones, are we going down in the basement? You know, are we doing those things? Safety is big. Obviously, it's the biggest. Um, as a parent, I've never asked for a safety plan when I've gone to camp. You know, I've never asked that. Well, public schools are not accredited. Private schools are accredited, not public schools. Um, so there's that. But anyway, I think that is just there's a lot we're hearing, and there's a lot more we're going to hear, and I think it's worse when it'd be a lot better if you just felt like, you know, it was a tsunami, right? Um, public schools are accredited. Well, it's not the same. Like, there's not like a national accreditation system for public schools. Um, so it's different than like the National Camping Association. So it's not the same thing like for a private school. Um, it's different. You've never heard of camp accreditation? Well, only because I'm on the board of a camp and we talk about it a lot. That, and we talk about safety and, you know, just knowing like if something happened at the camp where I'm on the board, that you could say to Adrian, like, did you ever talk about safety? And I could say, yeah. And I saw the safety plan and I can tell you what it said, you know? Um, so anyway, but thank y'all for tuning in. And hopefully we learn something because that is a lot of families that will never be the same. Never be the same. You know, I lost my only sibling to cancer. Nobody could do anything about it. You know, it just happened. I can't imagine um, if you felt like it was something that, you know, could have been prevented. Just break your heart. Thank you.